Since the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by the United Nations General Assembly in 1948, human dignity has been a key term associated with the global struggle for human rights. In the preamble to the Universal Declaration, we find a direct link between the inviolable dignity and worth of the human person and the inalienable rights of all members of the human family. We see a similar link between dignity and rights a year later in the 1949 Basic Law of the Federal Republic of Germany, which says, "Human dignity shall be inviolable. To respect and protect it shall be the duty of all state authority. The German people therefore acknowledge inviolable and inalienable rights as the basis of every community." In these documents, dignity, understood as the intrinsic equal worth of every human being, is the claimed basis of universal human rights. As the United Nations International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights from 1966 would put it, the equal and inalienable rights of all people derive from the inherent dignity of the person. Human rights are human dignity made effective, the legal recognition of individuals' intrinsic worth, and the practical means of protecting it. Human rights ensure that people are treated in the ways that their dignity requires. Such, at least, is the received tradition of contemporary human rights discourse. As is well known, this grounding of the individual's inalienable rights in dignity as the inherent worth of the individual person is largely a legacy of 20th century Christian thought, especially through the influence of Christian thinkers such as Jacques Maritain and Charles Melick on the Universal Declaration. Prior to the 1940s, secular discourse on human rights made no reference to human dignity, which at the time had emerged as a core concept of Catholic social thought. Despite its Christian origins, however, this 20th century alliance between human dignity and human rights can hardly be taken for granted from a Christian perspective, as the modern history of the term dignity shows. Initially, the language of dignity became popular in 19th century Catholic social thought, not as a basis for human rights, but at least partly as a means of opposing rights discourse and liberal and democratic reforms. Dignity in this earlier tradition did not refer to an intrinsic attribute of individuals considered in the abstract, but primarily to certain social roles, such as the dignity of labor, within a divinely established right order, and by extension to the persons who find themselves in those roles. But there were differences in the dignity of these roles, which led not to the concept of equal or universal human rights, but to specific rights for specific roles within a just but hierarchical social order. Rights, in this case, were about recognizing the dignity of these roles and harmonizing their interests in relation to the common good. There is thus no consensus on the relationship between dignity and rights in recent Christian thought. Does a Christian concept of dignity provide a foundation or support for the equal, inalienable, universal rights of individuals? Or should it instead be the basis of a Christian alternative to human rights? Complicating the question is the multivalence of the term dignity itself. Christians do not disagree only about how to relate dignity and rights. They are not always of one mind about precisely what the terms of the relationship refer to in the first place. When Christians talk about dignity and its relation to rights, are we talking about some kernel of inherent inviolable worth present in each individual person? Or does dignity belong more properly to the social roles that persons occupy? Or finally, perhaps Christians ought to link dignity more closely to moral behavior, to the idea of acting in a dignified manner, and thus as something that could be obscured, diminished, or forfeited by behavior that is immoral or undignified. Whatever one's approach, Christian reflection on human dignity is entwined with the question of human rights. The different approaches Christians take to the question of human rights all tend to embody different facets or different meanings of the word dignity itself. This means that the Christian understanding of human dignity is also bound up with wider debates about Christianity's relationship to political ideologies centered on human rights, including, most significantly, liberal democracy. Dignity, whatever one means by it, often serves as a focal point for Christian engagement with liberal democracy. Thus, while the Catholic fusion of dignity and human rights in the 1940s reflected the warming of Catholic attitudes towards liberal democracy amidst elevated concerns about totalitarianism, the close of the Cold War era revived debates about Christianity's compatibility with at least certain features of the liberal democratic tradition and reopened the question of human dignity's relationship to human rights. The concept of dignity plays an important role in many Christian engagements with liberalism and liberal understandings of the rights of the individual. For some, it is a point of contact between Christianity's affirmation of the sacred worth of the human person and liberalism's core commitments, while for others, it is a tool for identifying and articulating the ways in which liberalism deviates from a Christian understanding of the human person. Dignity, in other words, is a rather malleable concept. Far from providing a basis for a universal Christian consensus on human rights, dignity finds itself pressed into the service of competing and sometimes diametrically opposed approaches to rights. Given this flexibility of the term, a cynic might be tempted to dismiss the term altogether. However, Christians cannot so easily abandon the notion of dignity because, at heart, what the word names is a theological non-negotiable, the sacred worth of the human person as created in God's image. By determining exactly what this worth consists in and what it entails for Christian engagement with political liberalism and with human rights is perhaps a primary, most fundamental challenge facing Christian thinking on dignity today. And what follows, I'm going to briefly consider two recent examples that illustrate two different ways in which dignity factors into Christian critiques of prevailing accounts of individual human rights. Both examples share a conviction that I suggest is incontestable from a Christian perspective, namely that a strong Christian account of human dignity is, at the very least, irreducible to human rights. That is, human rights do not capture everything Christians want to express when they talk about dignity. In fact, the idea that there is a gap between human rights and the fullness of human dignity is not unique to Christian understandings of dignity. The view is also shared by many secular accounts. For instance, in his recent work on the history of human rights, Not Enough, Samuel Moyne has shown that the ascendancy of human rights discourse since the late Cold War period coincided with a decline in a socialist commitment to the equal distribution of resources, and as such has mostly been inadequate to prevent the growth of tremendous material inequality around the globe. Moyne's thesis illustrates one way in which, even from a non-religious perspective, the prevailing liberal human rights tradition might fall short of the demands of a robust conception of human dignity. If greater material equality is a precondition for the increasing of human flourishing, then the inadequacy that Moyne identifies suggests that the full flowering of human dignity might require something more than what human rights alone are able to deliver. Likewise, human rights are clearly not enough to capture everything included in a full Christian account of the dignity of the person. The theological basis of a Christian notion of dignity, the affirmation of the human person as a bearer of the image and likeness of God, points to a vision of human flourishing in excess of rights, namely communion with God, or theosis. This vision of human flourishing exceeds rights in at least a couple of ways. First, the dignity of my neighbor places demands on me that are irreducible to any clearly defined rights claims. It is not enough that I do not exploit my neighbor. I also must love my neighbor as God loves them, by seeking the full unfolding of their human potential as a way of honoring the divine image within them. Such love might justify my support for certain rights claims, but it cannot be fully expressed by rights alone. A second aspect of dignity also comes into focus here. Loving my neighbors is not only how I respect their dignity, it is also how I act in accordance with my own dignity as a bearer of God's image, and how I advance towards a fuller likeness with the God who is love. One of the ways in which I love my neighbors, in turn, is by helping them to love others as well, including myself, thereby helping them to participate more fully in divine love and advance with me into a deeper communion with and in the Trinity. Dignity from this perspective is therefore inseparable from communion, from mutual responsibility, and from mutual self-sacrifices on behalf of the other. None of these is fully expressed in liberal notions of individual rights. For this reason, Christians should be cautious of any account of human dignity that reduces it to nothing more than a foundation for liberal individual rights. Christian critics of liberal rights often go a step further, however. For some, dignity is not just a more expansive concept than rights, but is at some way at odds with the prevailing liberal rights discourse. This tension between dignity and rights arises largely because of the moral dimension dignity receives here, understood as dignified or virtuous action, action reflecting humanity's call to share in God's likeness, in contrast with liberalism's supposed neutrality on the question of morality and the good. Both the examples that I'm going to summarize share this basic understanding. I begin with the foremost contemporary theological critic of liberalism, the British theologian John Milbank. Milbank's approach to human dignity and human rights is situated within his larger project of out-narrating political liberalism and secular social thought, with an explicitly theological Christian alternative. Thus, invoking the legacy of the early Catholic social encyclicals, Milbank does not treat human dignity as a basis for rights at all, but as a superior alternative to rights. Dignity rather than rights, as the title of one of his essays states. Milbank decries the 20th century yoking of dignity to rights, seen in documents like the Universal Declaration, as an illegitimate coming together of what he calls two quite different and indeed fundamentally opposed traditions of political and ethical reflection. The Catholic tradition of dignity tied to specific roles, distinct from each other, but equally oriented towards an objective common good, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the liberal tradition of individual rights rooted in the subjective exercise of individual freedom, abstracted from social relations and social responsibilities. According to Milbank, the result of this yoking was not a legitimate theological reconciliation between the two traditions, but ultimately the capitulation of Christian dignity discourse to the logic of secular liberalism, and the collapse of a rich notion of human dignity into the narrower notion of subjective individual rights. The crux of Milbank's concern is that this liberal fusion of dignity and rights ultimately works against the highest forms of human flourishing by abstracting individuals from the concrete social roles and relationships where they can cultivate the virtues that bring about their flourishing. For Milbank, it's precisely by practicing the virtues within these roles that human persons realize their specific dignity. Indeed, for him, dignity is virtue. Milbank's theory of dignity has two aspects, which can map onto the distinction between divine image and divine likeness. First, dignity as the universal human capacity for virtue, and second, dignity as variously realized in virtuous actions that are fitting for one's specific rank and role. Therefore, in contrast to liberalism's focus on the value-neutral protection of individual rights and the creation of an even playing field in which all can exercise their subjective freedoms and pursue their own private goods, Milbank sees the goal of politics as the promotion of dignity in both of these aspects, respecting all people for their capacity to practice virtues specific to their roles, while also according more honor to those who are more virtuous, and diverse types of honor according to the diverse but equally necessary modes of living dignified lives. We find similarities in the discourse on dignity and rights in the Russian Orthodox Church from the mid-2000s on, where dignity is once again a key term in the critique of mainstream human rights theory. Unlike Milbank, these Russian critiques do not present an outright rejection of human rights language in favor of dignity language. What they do offer, however, are repeated warnings about ways in which the Western system of individual rights supposedly threatens to undermine dignity. Consider then Metropolitan Kirill's 2006 address to the 10th World Council of the Russian People, which echoes the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by affirming human dignity as, I quote, the main motive for and justification for the existence of rights. But he doesn't offer any unqualified endorsement of the human rights tradition, since the main thrust of his lecture is to warn about the supposed abuse of human rights in support of behaviors that, again I quote, conflict not only with the Christian, but also with the traditional moral understanding of the human person. And among these, he lists mockery of sacred things, abortion, homosexual activity, euthanasia, and other activities that are commonly advanced as fundamental human rights in Western democracies. Here we see a pervasive concern that runs throughout the patriarch's public addresses on human rights, one that's mostly absent from Milbank's critiques, namely the alleged role of human rights in normalizing and indeed in promoting supposedly immoral personal behavior. The preservation of moral norms from the erosive influence of individual rights detached from moral responsibility is a driving motivation, if not the driving motivation, behind the patriarch's approach to human dignity and human rights and the relationship between them. The response to such concerns, formally articulated in the 2008 document on the Russian Church's basic teaching on human dignity, freedom, and rights, does not quite follow Milbank's path of promoting dignity rather than rights. Instead, it offers a radical reformulation of the human rights concept in line with a supposedly orthodox understanding of human dignity rooted in the doctrine of theosis. Not an alternative to rights, but an alternative, deliberately non-Western and non-liberal theory of rights. Dignity is once again foundational to the response. Basic teaching, just like the Universal Declaration, begins with an affirmation that human rights theory is based on human dignity. The problem, according to the document, is that human rights theory has excluded the aspect of moral responsibility present in a Christian understanding of human dignity, and thus needs to be reworked. As with Milbank, the proposed conception of dignity is double-faceted and based on the image-likeness distinction. It combines dignity as the ultimate worth of every person with the idea of dignified life as the struggle to, quote, overcome sin and seek moral purity and virtue, end quote. The purpose behind this move is to establish an essential connection between human dignity and moral norms, such that the failure to live in accordance with those norms strikes at the dignity of the person. A human being preserves his God-giving dignity and grows it only if he lives in accordance with moral norms, the basic teaching document states. The document acknowledges that dignity as worth is in some sense inalienable, yet it also asserts that habitual violation of moral norms, quote, darkens the person's dignity so much as to make it hardly discernible, end quote. Consequently, if the function of human rights is to protect human dignity, then this deontological conception of dignity introduces a new dimension of freedom that must be incorporated into human rights theory. Not just a liberal freedom of choice, but freedom from sin, freedom from the violation of received moral norms. The result is a somewhat different focus from Milbank's use of dignity to promote and reward virtuous performance of social roles. Milbank's Christian socialist focus is on honoring the dignity of those vocations which serve the common good and protecting the freedoms necessary to carry out those vocations. For the Russian Church, however, the category of moral norms effectively replaces Milbank's idea of the common good. And consequently, there is a much stronger emphasis in the Russian Church on the role of human dignity as a limitation on personal liberty in relation to the community's traditional moral values. Thus, according to Patriarch Kirill, human rights must not conflict with moral norms that are recognized by most people as desirable behavior. The linking of dignity to norms allows human rights language to be turned against certain behaviors that, in many Western liberal contexts, would fall under the protection of individual rights. The Patriarch quotes, people should have the right to be shielded from the consumption of drugs and alcohol, gambling and sexual promiscuity, and other forms of immoral behavior. Similar sentiments were reaffirmed, for instance, in the 2008 document's proposal that the right of free expression does not include the right to make public statements that further the propagation of sin or that insult religious feelings, and so forth. This way of relating human dignity and human rights is driven, no doubt, by anxieties about an aggressive secularism marching into traditional Orthodox countries under the banner of universal human rights, a fear that Patriarch Kirill has voiced repeatedly in his public lectures on the subject. Although it is important to examine the potential points of divergence between prevailing approaches to human rights and a Christian account of human dignity, and to explore ways in which a Christian theology might correct deficiencies in secular rights theory, the Russian Church's treatment of the topic is severely compromised by its excessive entanglement with post-Cold War geopolitical rivalries with the West. It is this entanglement that leads to an imbalanced focus on dignity's role in restricting human behavior, since human dignity functions here overwhelmingly as a justification for traditional moral norms in the face of international human rights criticisms. What this geopolitical framing tends to obscure is adequate, careful attention to the more positive dimensions of protecting human dignity as inherent worth. For example, there's abundant justification in the documents here for restricting, say, the promotion of homosexual relationships. But apart from lip service about how sexual minorities should not be subjected to violence, there's very little consideration of how an orthodox alternative to Western human rights might protect and promote the full dignity of those who choose to enter into same-sex relationships. In general, there's too little focus on the prevention of what the community deems sinful, and too little attention to how human rights safeguard the inalienable worth of sinners, as those who choose to live out of step with the community's moral norms. What we find, in short, is an attempt to think through the relationship between dignity and rights that is too constrained by its oppositional character vis-a-vis the West. Milbank's proposal for dignity as an alternative to rights comes across as, in many ways, a more theologically pure attempt to think through the problem from a dogmatic rather than from a culture war perspective, even though it too is marred by Milbank's perception of a fundamental rivalry between Christianity and secular liberalism as two competing meta-narratives. While the connection of dignity to virtue is central to Milbank's approach, it avoids the overly moralistic direction of the Russian Church's approach. Its focus is on structures that promote and honor civic virtue rather than on preventing sin. That said, Milbank is frustratingly vague about what honoring and promoting virtue would look like in practice. Moreover, it is unclear how his vision could be enacted outside of a strong, confessionally Christian state to organize the various functions of society around the common good. And indeed, Milbank has tied his proposal to a broader vision of Christian monarchy, something that is altogether unpalatable to us Americans. We're given little idea of how those of us who live in a pluralist liberal democratic context, such as my home country, might pursue his ideas might put his ideas of dignity into practice, short of completely refashioning our government. In short, Milbank's proposal offers no clear guidance on how Christians might work to promote dignity within and through the liberal democratic structures in which many of us already find ourselves. This means that Milbank gives no clear sense of how a Christian understanding of human dignity might contribute to or supplement liberal theories of rights, perhaps even correcting them in places, rather than just offering an alternative to them. In other words, Milbank's is more a vision of what an ideal Christian society might look like than it is a vision of social ethics for an imperfect and pluralistic world, the world that we actually inhabit. Yet perhaps, in some sense, a Christian notion of dignity requires such a vision of an ideal Christian society, namely the church, understood in its eschatological perfection. The Russian religious philosopher Vladimir Solovyev, an ardent defender of what he called the absolute divine significance of the human person, argued that this human significance can be fully realized only when the human personality finds itself within the church. That is, only within the communion of ecclesial subornost. If human dignity is teleological, if it is not only a static possession of the individual, but is something that is to be attained in the fulfillment of the collective human potential for deification as participation in divine love, then Christians cannot really understand human dignity apart from their imagining of the church as an eschatological community founded on that love. If that is the case, then the question of the relationship between dignity and rights ultimately becomes a question of the church's relationship to secular society, including, especially, liberal democratic society. Both Milbank and the Russian Church presume an ecclesiastical triumphalism that offers little instruction for how Christians are to incarnate the ecclesial ideal of human dignity within secular, pluralistic, liberal democratic contexts, such as the United States or Western Europe. Therefore, one of the challenges for a Christian understanding of dignity today, I think, is to determine how to demarcate between those degrees and types of dignity which are achievable by secular means through the political and legal defense of human rights, and those types of dignity which require the extra-political supplement of the church. Without such a clear demarcation, Christians run the risk of either collapsing their understanding of dignity into liberal rights, or else failing to appreciate the protections for individual liberties that liberal rights afford. The challenge for Christian thinkers, then, is to discern how to make use of liberal human rights tradition while simultaneously recognizing that it is not enough. Thank you.